I'm not Boris Karloff. It's just me, Chris, your friendly neighborhood Poe Museum curator. You might know Karloff for such films as The Mummy and Frankenstein. But you might not know he also starred in one of the greatest Edgar Allan Poe films ever made. And that will be the subject of tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, in addition to all these books and periodicals you see all throughout the Poe Museum Reference Library, we also have a collection of CDs and DVDs and VHS tapes. You can ask your parents what these were. And this is one that was given to the library by one of our former gift shop managers back in 1999. And she wrote a note on the back that says, "There is no similarity between this film and Poe's story, The Black Cat. In this film, a black cat is on screen 2 or 3 times. That's it. Do not ever buy this film for the museum shop." So she was not a fan. But I gotta tell you, I kind of am a fan of this film. Even though she is right, she's not wrong, it bears no similarity between Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Black Cat, but The Black Cat with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi is probably one of the few movies that's really captured the Poe spirit. Have you seen it? Well, let's tell you a little about it. It represents the first time that the two superstars of 1930s horror cinema were on screen together. That's Bela Lugosi of Dracula and Boris Karloff of Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi had become a household name with his starring role in Dracula just 3 years earlier. And later that same year, Boris Karloff shot to superstardom playing the monster in the 1931 Frankenstein. You know, he's the one with the flat head, so they could put a brain inside there. Lugosi had actually turned down the role of Frankenstein's monster, but he lived to regret it. He quickly became typecast as a villain in B movies, whereas Karloff shot to superstardom. The thing is, Lugosi might have been typecast as a villain, but he was really good at it. Just look at that 1932 film, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Another loosely interpreted Poe adaptation. Now, Universal Pictures was a production company behind all these great early horror films like Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy, The Werewolf of London, The Wolfman, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. So it was only a matter of time before they had the great idea of pairing their two biggest horror stars, Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, together, and that film was going to be Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat. And by this time, Karloff's a rising star, so he got $7,500 for 4 weeks of work. It doesn't sound like much now, but that was a lot of money back then, especially considering that for the same amount of work, Lugosi, with the same screen time, got $3,000. So you can see why people thought, well, maybe Lugosi's a little bit envious. Maybe he never really got over having passed up the Frankenstein part. The director, Edgar Ulmer, had worked with Germany's leading expressionist directors, including F.W. Murnau, the Nosferatu guy. So he's going to bring a stunning visual sense to the movie. It almost looks like an animated expressionist painting. And it has a continuous soundtrack, which was kind of rare throughout that time, that adds a level of unreality to the whole thing. It looks like a nightmare come to life. So first of all, do you remember Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Black Cat? Well, there's no use remembering it for this film because it bears no similarity. But basically, The Black Cat is about a man who loves his beautiful black cat named Pluto. He adores it. And then, because he's driven on by some inner demons, decides to pluck out the cat's eyeball. Just because he knows he'll never be able to forgive himself, he plucks it out. And then the cat comes back and forgives him, so he hangs it from a tree. Then his house burns down. And guess what? Another cat, a big black one-eyed cat, shows up, takes its place, and the man decides, I have to get rid of this cat now. So he chases around the house with an axe. I've got to chop this cat in little pieces. His wife gets in the way, says, please, please don't hurt my little cat. So he buries the axe in her brain. And then he's got a problem. I got a body to hide. So he hides the body down in the basement, bricks it up behind a wall. Eventually, people start to miss his wife. The police come over, they search the house, and the man almost gets away with his crime until the police down in the basement hear the howling of a cat from behind the wall. They uncover the crime, and that animal abuser is sent to the gallows. So the cat won in the end. But that's not the plot of the movie. In fact, this movie bears so little resemblance to Poe's story that it was released originally in the UK under the title The House of Doom. But in the US, they thought that if they called it Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, it would have a greater appeal. And in fact, it did have a great appeal. It became Universal's most profitable movie of the year. And it inspired Universal the following year to come out with another Poe-themed movie, The Raven, also starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. So here's what happens in the film. Bela Lugosi plays Vertigast, and he's traveling by train. He meets this young couple who are on their honeymoon, and he tells them, just to break the ice, I just got out of prison after 15 years. It was such a horrible prison that everyone else who was sent there went insane, but I made it, and I'm on my way to kill my enemy, Mr. Polzig, because he ran off with my wife 15 years ago. And apparently this somehow endears him to the couple, and they're traveling together, but they crash, and they take the injured wife to Polzig's house, played by Boris Karloff. Now, if you're thinking, oh, there's the Poe connection, they named Polzig after Poe. No, it's just a coincidence. They named him after the architect Hans Polzig, and he's not really based on Poe either. He's maybe based on the Satanist Aleister Crowley, and he's even got a weird satanic haircut. So they take him over to Polzig's house. Polzig welcomes everybody in the house and says, "I'm glad to have you here." And eventually they find out Polzig has a black cat, and Vertigast is terrified of black cats. He has a great phobia of cats, and he just screams and throws things at him. He just can't stand to be around them. And people point out that's supposed to be the connection between this movie and Poe's story, The Black Cat. But I think they're missing the most obvious Poe connection. Remember how I told you Polzig ran off with Vertigast's wife? Well, she's dead now, and he's got her body down in the basement. That's such a Poe thing. If you look at The Cask of Amontillado, you got Fortunato down there in the wine cellars. You look at The Fall of the House of Usher, Madeline Usher. She's down there entombed beneath the house. Even the Black Cat, put her down in the basement. Where else? So that's the perfect Poe connection there that a lot of people have missed over the years. So anyway, to top that off, not only is Vertigast's wife dead, but Polzig is sleeping with Vertigast's daughter, who is his stepdaughter, who's also played by the same actress who played the dead wife. And did I mention that Polzig built his big modernist mansion on top of a World War I battlefield? These are World War I veterans. You know, this is from 1934, so these are people who survived the horrors of trench warfare, and he decided this would be a perfect place to build my big mansion. So they're all in this great big mansion. And by the way, Polzig also is a leader of a satanic cult, and they practice their cult rituals downstairs. And since they've got this new bride there, they think, well, might as well sacrifice her. And the only thing standing in the way of this young honeymooner getting sacrificed by the satanic cult is the revenge-obsessed madman Vertigast. So you think it's not looking too good for her, but Vertigast eventually decides to get his revenge by skinning Polzig alive. So this movie really pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in Hollywood back then. In fact, this squeaked in just before the strict enforcement of the Hollywood Code that really set the standards of what you could and could not show on screen. It was sort of a voluntary code that the production companies followed to make sure there wasn't any excessive, blasphemy or satanic rituals, human sacrifice, murder, or any naughty things on screen like profanity. And here you've got a lot of that happening in this movie. So you can see why it was kind of controversial and why audiences flocked to it. But at the same time, just to be released in the UK, the censors there had to make heavy cuts on it. And it was almost immediately banned in Italy and Finland and Austria. It was a little bit too intense for those audiences there. And maybe that's why it's become a cult classic, but it just would not have been possible if it had been released just a few months later when the code really got strictly enforced. On a side note, one of my favorite parts of the production is the attention to detail they took in selecting the black cat for the movie. Here's some publicity footage from the time of Karloff and Lugosi auditioning black cats for the movie. So as I mentioned earlier, after this, Karloff and Lugosi starred in multiple films together. They followed up the next year with The Raven, which had about as much to do with Edgar Allan Poe's poem The Raven as this one had to do with the black cat. And over the years, they continued their association with Poe, especially Karloff. By 1938, he did a radio show version of The Telltale Heart called The Evil Eye, which was apparently so terrifying that a U.S. senator actually went to Congress and said, we should ban this, we should censor this. And then just a few years later, he did another radio show version of The Telltale Heart, but not quite as good. In 1961, for his television show Thriller, he did a version of The Premature Burial. And nearly 3 decades after Karloff starred in his first Edgar Allan Poe movie, he starred in his last, 1963's The Raven, right here, alongside Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, and Jack Nicholson there. And just like his first Poe movie, it had just about nothing to do with its supposed source material. But after all that, I still think that Karloff's best Poe movie was his first. So if you've seen The Black Cat, let us know down in the comments what you think. And if you haven't seen it, check it out now. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces, like our Black Cat movie posters or VHS tape, why not support the Poe Museum or become part of the team at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I'll leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum's Black Cats.